here today to talk about Raspberry Pi. So this is a brief outline of what we'll be covering today in our presentation. We'll start off with an overview of the product and its purpose, followed by a technical analysis, a user analysis, a business analysis. We'll also be talking about the benefits, shortcomings, and impacts of the product, and finish off with a conclusion. So what is Raspberry Pi? Our product is a credit card-sized computer weighing only 45 grams, and it performs all the functions of a regular computer without the heavy cost. The mastermind behind this product is Eben Upton. He is the founder, trustee, and executive director of the Raspberry Pi Foundation, which is a UK-registered charity whose goal is to help make a positive impact in the digital divide that exists in the world today. So a little historical background of Raspberry Pi. The concept first originated in 2006 when Eben and a few of his colleagues from Cambridge University, they realized that the incoming university students were struggling with the course curriculum because they lacked real computer knowledge. They understood that computers were becoming so expensive that the idea of experimenting or simply reprogramming them was entirely dismissed. They wanted to create a product that performed all the functions of a traditional PC without the heavy costs. By February 29th, 2012, the first Raspberry Pi released. They had 2 online web shops, the first being sold out within a few minutes of the initial launch time, and the second having over 100,000 orders in just one day. By September 2012, over 500,000 Raspberry Pis have been sold. Frank will be talking about the technical analysis of Raspberry Pi.
All right, thanks, Stella. Now, as you can see by this chart here, I've compared the Raspberry Pi models A, B, and B2 to 3 of the top leading computer manufacturers and their desktops. As you can see, the Raspberry Pi is considerably less powerful than the HP, the Dell, and the Acer computers, but what it lacks in processing power and memory it makes up for greatly in price. Now, if I can just focus on the HP for a moment. The HP has 3200 megahertz of processing power, whereas the Raspberry Pi Model A only has 700 megahertz. But the Raspberry Pi is over 16 times cheaper than the HP. So as an alternative for someone who doesn't need that much power in their computer, a Raspberry Pi would be the perfect alternative. Now, you may think that with the low processing power and the lack of internal memory, the Raspberry Pi would actually be a bad investment, and that people looking for a more powerful machine would want to steer clear of it. But as evidenced by Southampton University, with their supercomputer, they combined 64 Raspberry Pis together with 64 SD cards and came up with a device that had 11 gigahertz of processing power and 1 terabyte of internal memory. And it only cost them $4,000, whereas in the past, a supercomputer of this size would have costed tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is a pretty good argument for Moore's Law in effect here. Now, the Raspberry Pi also has potential as a single-use device, which is evidenced by a student of Cal State who was tired of his laptop being tied up by the 3D printing applications when he would hook it up to his 3D printer because it would take up to 5 hours to finish printing. But with the Raspberry Pi, since it's so cheap and so compact, he was able to replace his laptop with the Raspberry Pi just for simply the use of 3D printing while the laptop's free to do other tasks. And again, the single device of the Raspberry Pi is not enough to overtake an entire desktop computer market. It's more of a complementary machine. But through the use of grid computing, which is the combination of several devices to create one greater device, pooling all the processing power together and their combined memory, the Raspberry Pi has the potential to overtake the desktop market at the moment, because users would only have to pay for a certain amount of devices that they need, and it would cover the exact amount of processing power they need and only the features they needed to perform. Because I could probably ascertain that most people pay for features on their computer that they don't even know they have or don't require for their everyday life. And with that in mind, I'll pass it over to Wallace for the user analysis.
Thank you, Frank. So now looking at the target market of the Raspberry Pi, their main focus is going to be on the demographic of the millennials, whose age ranges from about 10 to 25 years. And so for the Raspberry Pi, these individuals are known to be the most adept and familiar with technology today. And it is also these individuals who are capable of providing the necessary groundwork that is required for technological innovation to the future. And in a recent study by Sanchez and Milan, they have figured out that technological innovation is based upon 3 fundamental characteristics. The first is human capital, which refers to the lifelong learning that individuals are able to get from the product. And we've already seen this with the Raspberry Pi. We've seen that the bare bones structure allows it to be a relatively inexpensive device for people to acquire. And the open source software also allows users to see how their program code works with the hardware. The second characteristic is technological capital. And technological capital refers to the amount of research and development that is invested by both the public as well as the businesses. And again, based on Raspberry Pi's price point, we can see that it is a very feasible investment for everyone. And the single-use device nature of the Raspberry Pi allows it to be a very important product that can span across multiple industries as well, automating different types of processes when needed. The third characteristic is relational capital. And relational capital simply refers to the total number of in-house, innovative, small to medium enterprises, as well as their collaboration with one another. And if we take a look at the demographic trends that are going on today, we can see that the baby boomers are moving out of the workforce with the younger generations coming in to fill in the gap. And when that happens, we can see a huge change in how business is done. Everything will become more technologically oriented, and in a different way, we can see that social networking will also become a bit more prevalent and available, meaning that collaboration as well as the opportunities to create innovative in-house businesses will be, there will be a higher chance for those. And the North American statistics for educational students within the educational system, we have about 32.8 million students currently enrolled. And of that, 5 million students are from elementary school, 4.7 million students are from secondary school, and 23.1 million students are from universities and colleges around. And the most important point to note here is that the computer science field is rapidly expanding at an accelerating rate. And universities are even finding it difficult to keep up because they essentially don't have the necessary faculty members to help cope with the inflow of the students that are coming into these schools. And in a sense, Raspberry Pi tends to be an essential technology that is required to pave the road to a brighter future for tomorrow. And now we'll let Ferris talk about the business analysis of the Raspberry Pi.
Thank you, Wallace. So, the profitability of a business depends on the strength of its position within the market. And that strength depends on 5 factors, which are the supplier's bargaining power, the buyer's bargaining power, threat of new entrants, threat of substitutes, and finally, industrial rivalry. So, in order for the Raspberry Pi Foundation to succeed, it needs to differentiate its product and make sure to avoid being placed in the same category as modern desktops. Being placed in the same category as modern desktops is gonna have the Raspberry Pi to face very fierce competition that they cannot handle at the moment with the models that they have launched so far. So, the Raspberry Pi Foundation needs to develop and market their product by using the blue ocean strategy. And what that means is that they need to create an image within the market where the product is perceived to be both unique and should be placed in a distinct product category. Additionally, the low cost of the Raspberry Pi should be maintained because it plays an important role as a competitive advantage. So, by the advancement of technology and the help of Moore's Law, the Raspberry Pi has a huge potential to be the next big thing. And now, Alan's going to talk to you about the benefits, shortcomings, and impacts of the product on the market.
So I'll be talking about the benefits of how the Raspberry Pi will actually benefit the individuals, society, and businesses alike. So I'll be talking about how it's a low-cost computer, it provides access to technology, how it's a learning tool for students, and how it's an open-source product. So we'll start off with the low-cost computer. A brief recap of what Frank said. The Raspberry Pi is an inexpensive computer that varies from $25 to $35, which is actually very inexpensive compared to normal computers, which can reach up to $1,000. And this is actually beneficial to businesses because of the fact that some businesses may not require all that processing power of a $1,000 computer. Now we move on to how the Raspberry Pi provides access to technology. So the Raspberry Pi Foundation is actually made its goal to actually provide Raspberry Pis or technology to disadvantaged schools and low-income households. Big firms like Google has actually recognized Raspberry Pi's efforts by actually purchasing 15,000 units of the Raspberry Pi for students in the UK. Now we'll be talking about how the Raspberry Pi is a learning tool for students. As you can see here, the Raspberry Pi can run many applications like a normal computer would. And on the right side here, it shows that the Raspberry Pi can actually be programmed to show students on how the Raspberry Pi actually works. Now, more importantly, we'll be talking about how Raspberry Pi is an open source product. As an open source product, the Raspberry Pi actually has no restrictions on how the user actually tinkers with it. Users can actually use the Raspberry Pi and make it into a mobile phone or change its hardware, software, anything to their liking. But that being said, there are also shortcomings to the Raspberry Pi. The first one being that the Raspberry Pi has not made a significant impact on the market share. The second being that it's only separated by price compared to the other products in the market. Also, not everyone has low income or wants the Raspberry Pi when they can get the new MacBook Pro or the new HP computer. And lastly, it requires additional peripheral devices such as the monitor, mouse, and keyboard. But overall, the Raspberry Pi has made an impact towards society, individuals, and families alike. It provides access to underprivileged individuals. It provides learning tools for students about software and hardware. It's an inexpensive alternative for basic computer needs. And finally, it cultivates innovative minds for future employees of businesses. And now I'll pass it on to Stella.
Thank you, Alan. The Raspberry Pi's unique and innovative design allows it to be highly distinguishable from others in the market. So, what is the future for Raspberry Pi? We expect that the company will expand their distribution channels, allowing it to be more accessible for everyone around the world. We also hope that businesses will help sponsor purchases to these less advantaged schools, allowing these underprivileged students to experience the vast world of the computer technology. Lastly, with Moore's Law taking into effect, we expect the model of the product to increase in efficiency, such as its processing speed and its memory capacity. The product's past and current success indicates that the product has already become widely adopted by many in the community. Therefore, it is reasonable to assume that the product will maintain to be in high demand in the market. So who will be the users of Raspberry Pi? Students of all programs will benefit, especially those in computer science. Industries such as medical, manufacturing, and educational will also benefit using Raspberry Pi. But the most important consumer will be children. Because Raspberry Pi is so widely used and intensely supported, we don't believe that this product will be just a fad. Many people will continue to use Raspberry Pi as a platform to build their own special projects at home. So will we invest in such an innovative and inexpensive product that helps foster innovation for the upcoming generation while providing an enormous opportunity for consumer growth? With its revolutionizing technology? Of course, we fully support Raspberry Pi. Thank you for listening to the presentation.